From earaches to strep tests, there's MinuteClinic at CVS. See a provider, fill a prescription, and grab essentials. Or see us online with telehealth options. That's healthier made easier. Visit MinuteClinic at CVS today. Services vary by location. See MinuteClinic.com for details.
This is a CBC podcast.
Calgary.
Hi, I'm David Gray.
And I'm Angela Knight.
Welcome to the Calgary Eye Opener podcast for Tuesday, November 23rd. Coming up, reducing frostbite cases among Calgary's homeless population. We'll hear about a new idea presented to City Council. We'll hear why Albertans lead the country in our love of salmon.
Apparently, we love it more than almost anybody.
As it turns out, pretty interesting considering we're not next to an ocean. But
yes.
Yeah. And we'll talk with a rancher near Millerville trying to figure out why Alberta Environment has dug big holes on land where she grazes her cattle. But first, Alberta's federal cabinet minister, Randy Boissonnault, will join us. Parliament's back, speech from the throne expected today. And after 2 years without a member of Parliament in cabinet, Alberta, well, it's back at the table. Edmonton's Randy Boissonnault is the Minister of Tourism and the Associate Minister of Finance. Of course, Calgary Skyview's George Chahal also won a seat for the Liberals, but he was passed over for a cabinet seat. Minister Boissonnault joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning, David.
What's it like to be back in Ottawa?
Well, you know, it's wonderful to see everybody from coast to coast to coast. It's been about, over 2.25 years since I've been in the chamber officially. So it's wonderful to represent the citizens of Edmonton Centre again and be there on behalf of all Albertans. And there's a lot of work to do, and we get to undertake it right after the speech from the throne today.
The second half of that description, represent all Albertans. It's a big job. You're the lone Albertan at the cabinet table. How will you ensure Alberta's voice is heard?
Well, part of my job is to work in lockstep with my colleague George Chahal from Calgary Skyview, and we've already taken a Team Alberta approach to work here on the Hill. We've been working very closely already on FIFA, trying to make sure that we get World Cup 2026 for Canada. We were at the Alberta Union of Municipalities Association together, now known as Alberta Municipalities. And there's a lot of work to do to cover, all of Alberta here on the Hill. So George and I are going to be working on that. And it's about making sure that our voices are heard, David, that our priorities are heard. And I know what I heard on the doors, and then I know what George heard on the doors. And it's climate change, it's affordability, it's childcare, and making sure that we get jobs back. So that's what we're going to be focused on.
That was a fair description, but I'm curious on the Alberta's voice part of this. When we use that phrase, what does Alberta's voice sound like to you? What is the Alberta you plan to represent in Ottawa?
Well, look, I will take this from a perspective of what I heard on the doors. I mean, we are progressive voices in the Parliament. We want to see COVID in the rearview mirror. We want our economy back. We want to make sure we've all seen what's been happening with the floods in British Columbia, the summer that we all lived through, the smoke in the air. We've got to tackle climate change. We've got to do our part. And we've got to do that in a framework that allows our oil and gas sector workers to continue to provide for their families. And so that means that we're in a transition. It's not a switch, it's a transition, and making sure that we have the smart people at our universities, in our oil and gas sector. The greenest barrel of oil is the one that the rest of the world is going to want to buy. We're a stable democracy, and we have the smarts to get this done. And so there is a transition underway, but I know we can get it done. And you will have seen, David, the $10 a day childcare announcement with Alberta, our government's first announcement, and almost $4 billion being transferred to the province. So those are the kind of things I want to make sure that we're working on in this Parliament.
You met with Premier Jason Kenney last week, a premier who has often locked horns with this Prime Minister. What issues were up for discussion? I think you probably mentioned some of them, but can you be more specific?
Sure. It was a very constructive conversation with Premier Kenney, and my goal, and it was a conversation that I had openly with the Premier, is to find common ground and common cause where we can, advance issues together inside the federal government. And this issue about making sure that we have broad-based job recovery is important. You mentioned my role as tourism minister. I mean, the Canadian economy, the Alberta economy, doesn't recover until the tourism sector recovers, and so one of my jobs is going to be to roll out a $500 million billion tourism relief fund across the country over the next 2 years. Very important for developing tourism assets. But back to the Premier, making sure that we pick our way through this, the emissions cap. It was very carefully orchestrated that it's not a production cap, it's not a sector cap, it's just a total emissions cap. And I know that the oil and gas sector is already well ahead of our own targets as a government. And so I'm confident in the sector's ability to get us to net zero. And that was a conversation that I had with the Premier, including issues of infrastructure and making sure that our perspective from Alberta is heard inside this government.
You mentioned the tourism industry. It's been hammered during COVID-19. Absolutely. I'm going to come to that issue in a moment because I'm curious to see how that money might be used in Alberta. But I can't leave the Premier question alone for a moment because the Premier says Albertans sent a strong message on the issue of equalization, his words, in last month's referendum. And he plans to start negotiations with the federal government. Where do you see this issue going in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, it's as I discussed with the Premier, and we were very open about the conversation. The federal government can't make changes to the Constitution unilaterally, and the next decision for the Premier is whether he will raise it or not at the Council of the Federation. That's the next place to raise this issue, and he and his colleagues were responsible for the current equalization formula when they were in the federal cabinet, and so if he has common cause with other premiers and they want to raise it at the Council of the Federation, that's exactly the next place that it will get raised. All right.
Let's go back to tourism. You know how important it is to this province, particularly to the areas west of where I'm sitting right now here in Calgary. Mm-hmm. How does that money actually change the plans or the future of tourism businesses, so many of which have had to actually shut down and give up over the last year?
It's really been devastating, David. And before politics and even between, I was in business. And I say to people, what happens when your demand goes to zero? Yeah. Well, your business either closes or you hope that the government's there. And for a number of businesses, we were, and a number of businesses survived. To your point, many didn't. And so there's a few things. We need to bring people back. We need to encourage people to travel again safely within our own country. We need to welcome people from around the world. And there are some challenges in there. Some of the people around the world have to go back home to 14 or 28-day quarantine. So that's a challenge. We have to reduce the stickiness at the border, which we've started to do. And then we're also going to have to tackle a 20-year labor issue in the tourism sector, 6-month employment, people needing to be dispersed across the country to get meaningful employment. And so that's a conversation that I'm having with the tourism sector. This $500 million that was put in Budget 21 is to provide up to $100,000 for organizations, municipalities, tourism operators, 50% matching dollars to be able to improve a tourism asset that they have. And so we want those tourism assets to be developed so that when people come to Calgary, they stay for not 2 days, but 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. When they come up to Edmonton, they stay for a number of days, and then they get to, go see Métis Crossing. They get out to the mountains. They get to do some rural and remote tourism, and that's the design of the fund. And I'll be working with the ministers responsible for the regional development agencies like Prairies Canada to be rolling out that fund in the coming months.
I appreciate tourism will be your focus, but you're wearing 2 hats here.
I am.
Associate Minister of Finance. How do these 2 portfolios mesh?
Well, they mesh in various different ways. I can think of the good ideas, and then the other side of my brain says, how do we pay for it? And how do we cost it? And what's the return on investment? So sometimes the conversations are really quick, and sometimes they take longer. But I'll be very involved in the budget consultation process, David, and in making sure that we have a real framework for economic growth. It's why I ran for office again. I want to see us maintain our quality of life as Albertans and as Canadians. And to do that, we've got to keep growing the economy. So that means more people and more productivity, and then we actually get to see us grow our economy. And that's the lens that I'm bringing to the work that I do as tourism minister, but also as Associate Minister of Finance.
Minister, the game's back on. Parliament's back on. You've got a busy day ahead. Thank you for taking time to join us this morning. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in person, perhaps even in studio someday in Calgary.
Wouldn't that be something? Best of luck to you.
All the best, David. Take care. Bye-bye.
That is Randy Boissonnault, the MP for Edmonton Centre and the only MP from Alberta in Justin Trudeau's cabinet. You're listening to the Calgary Eye Opener podcast. A homeless outreach team wants City Council to help set up warming centres over the winter. Chaz Smith, who you just heard in the news, is the president and CEO of Be the Change YYC Street Outreach. He told City Council about the issue of frostbite among people sleeping rough, and he's hoping that Council will make it easier to set up spaces for people to warm up during cold snaps. Chaz Smith joins us now to tell us more. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm fine. Good of you to join us. Tell me a bit about your organization, first of all. How long have you been around and what are your goals?
So Be the Change has been around for about 6 years. So our goal is to provide relief to people experiencing homelessness and help support them in ending the cycle of homelessness. So we are one of the only street outreach teams walking the streets at nighttime. We provide emergency essentials like food, water, clothing, tents, tarps, and program referrals to other essential services like housing, detox, and emergency shelters to hopefully end the cycle of homelessness. Our team is primarily made of nurses, social workers, we have EMTs, firefighters, community addiction support workers, and what's interesting is we are 90% volunteer run.
All right. So what are you asking for from City Council?
So we know that there is a lot of, empty space specifically in the downtown core. The city has a lot of infrastructure that's underutilized during peak periods where it is extremely cold outside. So when we look at Alberta Health records, we see that 37% of all frostbite discharges in Calgary are people experiencing homelessness, and 50% of the time they receive an amputation. And while the homeless population only makes up 0.25% of our population, it's extremely high that 37% of all hospital discharges relating to frostbite is indeed a person experiencing homelessness.
So how can City Council solve that through you? What is it you're asking for?
So we're asking for some of that underutilized infrastructure to be made available to us so that we can operate emergency warming centers. So this would be a few places throughout the city, 3, one in the north, one downtown, one in the south, that would be used as a drop-in place during those cold periods where people experiencing homelessness can simply drop in and use the heat to warm up. And when they leave, we would provide them with emergency blankets, gloves, toques, possibly emergency shelter if they need, and hand and feet warmers to prevent those hospitalizations.
I'm just trying to picture it. What would it look like when I walk into this space, and what would this space have previously been used for?
So we've looked at a few different spaces, and while it might not be used in exactly these spaces, we've looked at a few heated parkades that the city owns, and so those facilities are heated already. They have lights, electricity, also train stations, for example, Marlborough or 39th Avenue Station. And so a person experiencing homelessness would simply come, they would drop in. We would have a social worker teamed up with bylaw services that would be there already. We would greet them and we would talk with them. We would provide those emergency essentials on site that they would need to warm up. And we would try and engage in meaningful conversations about accessing other resources to hopefully get them off the streets at the same time while they are warming up.
You're talking about some spaces, when I'm thinking heating parking garages, for example, where currently security is paid to keep homeless people out of those spots. So you're talking about a real rethink in how we look at these warming spaces, aren't we?
I think so in some cases. And what happens is we create a bit of a conflict in our system by not allowing that population to access. So it creates a bit of resentment and it creates a system of conflict, whereas those individuals are consistently still trying to access. So instead of using law enforcement as the way to remove that population, how can we sort of leverage that reality that they are still coming as soon as, police disappear, they're just coming back? How can we use, educated staff of social workers to try and assist those individuals to prevent them from having to ultimately continue to come back?
If you walk down the Bow River today, you will notice, if you look into the trees, several encampments, large tents, tarps, where people are living rough. It's not that rare in this city for people who actually look for where these people are. Are you talking about places where they can just go to warm up during the day, or providing more places for people to shelter at night?
So we're talking about a drop-in service where people can warm up. A lot of individuals experiencing homelessness, and as you say, rough sleeping, as we call it, sleeping in tents and encampments, it definitely has grown throughout the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there was a resistance to accessing emergency shelters, and the pandemic has only, exacerbated the previous concerns. Many people don't feel safe in emergency shelters. There's other reasons. For example, pets. If you have a pet, you can't stay in emergency shelters. If you have a loved one, perhaps you're married and you're with your wife, or you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you will be separated in emergency shelters. And so there are these systems in place at shelters that actually are creating barriers for people to access. Not to mention, the Calgary Drop-In Center. They do great work with the system that they have, that we all have inherited, and the staff there, I commend for the job that they do. That building can hold up to 1,000 individuals, and the types of crimes and an environment that ends up being hosted there as a byproduct of having that many people together, it just becomes very toxic. Whether people can even sleep at night, that's the number one concern we consistently hear on street outreach. In a room full of that many people coughing, sneezing, farting, people have, mental health concerns, and they're screaming all night. And so, women often express the concerns of, sexual exploitation that takes place there as well, not to mention the gangs and the drugs that prey on the vulnerable population with such a high concentration of vulnerable peoples all in one place. So indeed, we do see lots of rough sleeping as a result.
I mean, you've raised concerns that perhaps we'll need to speak to the Drop-In Center about. But before I let you go, you raised these issues before council yesterday. What's the response been?
So we're continuing to work with City Council. I have also reached out to the Calgary Drop-In Center, Alpha House, and the Calgary Homeless Foundation. I'm hoping that we can all collaborate and continue this conversation to activate these emergency warming centers sooner rather than later.
Chaz, thanks for joining us to talk about this morning. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
That's Chaz Smith. He's the president and CEO of Be the Change YYC Street Outreach.
This is the Eye Opener podcast for Tuesday, November 23rd.
I think Albertans' taste for beef is well known. Do you know that we also apparently have an enormous appetite for salmon?
I certainly do.
Yeah, we're like the grizzly bears of Canada when it comes to loving salmon. It's true. According to a new report out of Dalhousie University, Albertans eat more salmon than almost anyone in Canada. Stephanie Colombo is the report's lead researcher, and she joins us now. Good morning, Stephanie.
Good morning. The grizzly bears.
That's us. That's us in Alberta. Just how much do Albertans love salmon?
Albertans love salmon more than anyone in Canada. The highest proportion out of any province is in Alberta. That's 84% of Albertans eat salmon.
Do we know why?
I've been trying to figure that out ever since we got the survey results. Maybe a couple of reasons. Like, A lot of people from the East Coast are transplanted to Alberta. They work there. Alberta right next door to BC. BC produces the most salmon of any province in the country. Other than that, I'm not really sure why.
And Albertans love to barbecue. Maybe that's part of it. That's the way a lot of our salmon's consumed. You know, I am fascinated in this because these are the kinds of things that interest me. But why are you fascinated? And why is it important to know how much salmon we're all eating?
Well, originally, I was thinking about people eating salmon. My area is in aquaculture, and thinking about, a lot of people say to me in the past, oh, I only eat wild salmon. I don't eat farmed salmon. Farmed salmon isn't good for you. And I didn't understand where they came up with that, where they got that idea from. So I've done a couple of studies in the past to kind of evaluate, is there a difference in wild and farmed salmon? And sure enough, there's not. It has to do with the species of salmon, not whether it was wild or farmed. The other thing that was interested in getting to know whether Canadians knew about how, where salmon came from in this country. So you can either get wild salmon, you can get salmon that are raised in net pens in the ocean or in land-based. And in BC right now, there's a push from the federal government to remove all net pen ocean-raised salmon and go only to the land-based model. Mm-hmm. It turns out most people don't know the difference between ocean net pens and land-based. Despite that there's been some reports that people are willing to pay more for land-based salmon. So I want to understand, what Canadians thought of that. We surveyed over 10,000 Canadians and asked them different questions about, do you like eating salmon? How much salmon do you eat? And, do you think that aquaculture is a sustainable way to grow salmon? If you don't eat salmon, why? Do you prefer salmon that are organic or that are raised in ocean pens, land-based? So we covered a lot of different questions to try to understand, what do Canadians know about salmon and what do Canadians want from salmon production?
Those are all fascinating questions. But eating salmon, like so many other food groups now, has become quite political. And you're right. I hear people standing in front of the fish counter asking pointed questions about where this salmon came from and how it was raised. I think people really do care, and perhaps Absolutely. They care for very good reasons. Are we becoming informed? And is there a right choice when you're standing at that fish counter?
I think the fact that we're asking these questions as consumers is important, and it's on trend with all of the things we're asking about from all of the food that we're getting. It's not just from salmon or seafood, but there seems to be some particular confusion about seafood, and I understand why. There's not a lot of labeling. There's a lot of different options. And so I think there is space right now to be able to inform consumers about making choices when they are at the seafood counter and providing them or arming them with the best information possible. I don't think there is a right answer. There's, eating salmon is highly nutritious. It's a very healthy source of protein, and especially for healthy fats like omega-3s. So you really can't go wrong. Some people have a preference with regards to taste. So we did this study last year looking at, the nutritional composition of different types of salmon that Canadians can buy, like sockeye or pink salmon, Chinook salmon, Atlantic salmon. And, there are pluses and minuses for different types of salmon. Sockeye is great. It's nutritionally dense. So for every bite of sockeye salmon you're taking, you're getting a load full of nutrients, especially omega-3 fatty acids. But it's very expensive. And it's also limited to, where you can buy that in Canada. Out here, it's really hard to get sockeye salmon because it's caught in the West Coast. Mm-hmm. It's wild caught, so there's limits to the sustainable catch. So not every Canadian can be buying wild sockeye every day just because we have to respect the sustainable limits. It's also the most expensive. It's very expensive. So if you want to have that for a treat once in a while, that's great. If you enjoy salmon on a more regular basis, farmed Atlantic is an excellent option because again, it is also nutritionally dense, but it's available everywhere across Canada. There's no seasonality to it, and it is one of the least expensive salmon options out there.
Well, and that's the one a lot of people see, and I only interrupt because people get confused by salmon. There's sockeye, chum, and or pink, and you don't know what's coming across, and then there's the Ocean Wise program that you see in restaurants that people are literally buy into because it's expensive. But you feel like you're making the right choice. But you're telling me that farmed Atlantic salmon isn't harmful for the environment, that people shouldn't be worried about that when they order it, in your opinion?
No, it's a very sustainable way of harvesting salmon. The industry has improved so much in the past 20 years using new technologies that really minimize the environmental impacts. And there's, as I mentioned, there's different methods. So with land-based salmon, there's no interaction with the ocean environment at all. They're grown in tanks on land, so the water is recirculated. There's no potential impacts in the water. In ocean net pen farming, the salmon are raised in the ocean. That's kind of a more natural way for them to grow. And also, the industry is adopting new technologies that have significantly mitigated any of the environmental effects that we may have seen, in the 70s. So things have changed a lot. And going forward...
Of course, the big concern, just on that front, because I can't leave it, the big concern is that you're contaminating wild fish stocks if you're buying that salmon. Are you saying that's not going on anymore?
That's really not the case so much as it was 30 years ago. The industry has really evolved. And I mean, the reality is that right now, 50% of our seafood is actually farmed, and we're not going to be able to harvest all of the protein and healthy fats that we need, for a population of 9 billion in the next 10 years or so. We need to start farming the seafood that we need because we need to respect those sustainable catch limits.
So what advice do you have for people as they're grocery shopping and looking for salmon?
Get the salmon that you like the taste of. If you frequently enjoy salmon in your meals, once a week, couple times a week, once a month, I definitely recommend Farmed Atlantic. It's a great source of protein and fat, and it's affordable, and you're involved in something that's sustainable. If you really like wild salmon, go for that once in a while. It's more expensive. We can't be having it all the time, but it's a great treat once in a while.
Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us to talk about this morning. As you pointed out at the beginning, a lot of Albertans consume a lot of salmon. I found this a very interesting conversation. That is Stephanie Colombo, the Canada Research Chair in Aquaculture Nutrition at Dalhousie University. Her latest research shows Albertans lead the country in how much salmon we eat per capita of anyone in Canada. You're listening to the Calgary Eye Opener podcast. A cattle grazing area west of Millerville is now apparently riddled with several large holes. They're part of what the Alberta Environment and Parks Ministry calls reclamation. But it is causing problems for Jody Ball's family ranch. They hold a forestry allotment in the area. And Jody's on the line now. Good morning.
Good morning, Dave.
I haven't seen these. Can you explain what's going on?
Well, just to give you a little background, we are ranchers in the foothills west of Calgary. My husband, David, and our son, Luke, and myself have the McLean Creek Forestry Allotment. And that was purchased several years ago, about 15 years ago. And so every year our cattle, up to 200, graze there from June to October. And so this is a multi-use area. You've got ATVs, hikers, horseback riding, and, of course, the ranchers taking their cattle out to graze. So we were told a few years ago that the government would be closing a part of that grazing area called Sylvester Creek to all the off-road vehicles, the ATVs. And for a good purpose, it was to protect trout in the small creek there, and we're all for that. However, we just weren't aware of exactly what was going to happen. So they referred to it as a Sylvester Creek Reclamation Project. And, we were just told that the crossings would be taken out and the trails would be closed.
Okay. So that was the plan, as you understood it. Then what happened?
Okay, so we opposed it because these trails are over 80 years old, and our cattle graze and travel these trails every year, spring and fall. We use the crossings because they protect the creek, and they allow us to cross with cattle and horses without disturbing it. Also, we use the creek crossings to put out salt. And so, they're very important to us. So we sent letters to Alberta Environment and Parks, and the response we got from them was that they were going ahead with the project.
Just so I'm clear, when you say crossing, you're talking about a bridge structure? You're just talking about
bridges, and there was hard surface crossing so that, if you were on a quad, you could cross. Yeah. If you had salt, you wouldn't have to go in the creek.
Right, but those have been removed.
All removed.
Okay.
So we found this out when we were gathering cows in October. So our first gather, we get the main herd, and then later we go out for any stragglers. So it was a few weeks ago when we went out to find that 5 kilometers of trails were dug completely up, and this was with an excavator. So the grass was torn out. There were huge holes, 10 to 12 feet deep, the size of an excavator bucket, and great big piles of dirt, because that's where they put the dirt, so completely blocked off. And then all the crossings, they were taken out, but there was rolls of burlap with rebar spikes sticking out 6 to 8 inches. And then the culverts, instead of removing them, they just they removed some, but others are broken. There's sharp edges jutting out. So, it was a real shock to us, because to us, reclamation is to enhance natural productivity. At least that's what we thought.
Is that because it's still a process that is not done yet?
No, I believe it's done, but I'm not sure. We're trying to look into it. What we expected would be a locked gate with maybe some enforcement to control the quads, but we didn't expect the destruction. And I think our concerns are not only for our cattle, but for the wildlife. We saw that this burlap is full of straw, because I'm sure that they're using it as a filter. It's by the crossings. And the wild horses, the feral horses, are already eating the straw out of the burlap.
All right.
And so you think about even them in the wintertime, when these holes fill up with snow or water, and horses paw for their food. So here we've got all these spikes sticking out.
Just so I'm clear, they dug the big holes because as you see it, it's a way to block ATVers from getting onto the trail, because they can't go around them.
Yeah. So, an example. So we went out just recently because we had a bull out there that somebody else spotted with a helicopter. Yeah. And so we wanted to get him out. Well, he didn't know how to head home because all the trails are blocked. So where is he standing? In the creek bed. Right. And, so we had to go and get him. Right. And so we have talked to Alberta Environment and Parks, and in their fairness, there was one change when we recently went out. Somebody had gone out, I think, with a small backhoe and put a bit of the dirt, partially filled the holes, but they're still quite dangerous. They said that they would meet with us December 6th, but we recently spoke with the Executive Director of Lands, that is Rob Semerich, and he had no knowledge of the whole situation.
Oh.
So we feel like we haven't had a voice at all.
Well, as you point out, you've been grazing there for at least 5 years. You've been ranching for a long time, as I understand it. So, we're going back to the 30s there. So
these are 80-year-old trails.
You would think that there would just be somebody you could call who could explain it to you, but that's the issue you've got. You have no idea right now.
Yeah, and that's the frustration. And, I just wanted to end on one point that, as ranchers, our whole focus is to be good stewards of the land. Yeah. And so, environmentally, we can't help but wonder, where is the respect for the land when you see this? They tore up all the grass, anything that was there for years, it's just gone.
Is this a ministry plan, or do you know, or did they hire a company to do this? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, we're still trying to find it out.
Somebody designed this, right?
That's what we keep saying when we talk to them. There must have been a plan. What was the plan? But, we just haven't talked to anybody that's going to take responsibility or explain how this is a reclamation.
Well, we've talked about it now. A whole lot of people have heard this story, and I suspect we'll hear from government one way or the other on this, or from the ministry. But
hopefully.
Thank you for raising the issue and letting us know about it, and we'll see what happens next.
Okay, thank you for giving us a voice.
You bet.
Have a good day.
You too. That's Jody Ball. She's a rancher near Millerville. She sent some pictures. When we get them and find them, we'll throw them up so you can take a look. And that is the Calgary Eye Opener podcast.
I'm Angela Knight.
And I'm David Gray. Thanks for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.